Good day to you. This is being recorded on President's Day. Um, things are in pretty bad shape. Let me state up front so you know where I'm going. I think our president is in the process of destroying democracy and at home and fundamentally changing the role of the United States in the world. He has managed to do this in the last few weeks. Is there any good news? Not too much. One piece of slightly good news domestically was the fact that the prosecutor in New York stood up against the Trump administration with respect for handling the case of the mayor of New York. And 6 or 7 of the prosecutors in the Justice Department also said they would not follow what they have been told. In the end, it was resolved that the most senior person in the division of the prosecutors dealing with this matter in the Justice Department decided he would approve what Trump wanted in order to safeguard the jobs and the future of his younger colleagues. So that is how that played itself out. And that is actually a piece of good news in more than one way, because the New York prosecutor, whose name was Sassoon, I believe, she was actually not some kind of lefty liberal that they could accuse, but rather a very conservative person who was a member of the Federalist Society, etc. And she acted on the appropriate ethical and judicial points that she took into account. So it's kind of good news that there are beginning to be some Republicans who are also saying they're not willing to go along with everything they're being told to go along with. The other good news is that as I record this, the Europeans are meeting in Paris to figure out what to do and how to proceed. And there are many differences amongst the Europeans, but it's a very good idea that they get together and confront the present and the near future by also meeting with each other and figuring out what's going on. So then let me take for a minute the Middle East situation. There is nothing terribly new to report, except that the Secretary of State, Rubio, it was in Israel. He met and they had a news conference with Netanyahu. Rubio did not exactly say that he was supporting Trump's idea of building casinos in Gaza and getting rid of the Palestinians to some other countries. But he did say that, President Trump took a strong stand and so forth. In other words, he didn't disagree with anything. He just didn't enthusiastically support the specifics. Some hostages have been let go. What happens in the next round in Gaza is unclear. So I don't particularly want to spend a lot of time addressing all of these unknowns. What is known is that the king of Jordan met with Trump and, of course, was told that he needed to take the Palestinians that live in Gaza, or at least a chunk of them, which he did not agree with. Jordan already has a couple of million Palestinians, and he wasn't going to take any more. He made a gesture by saying that Jordan would accept, I think he said 200,000, that's a lot, of injured Palestinian kids from Gaza for them to get medical treatment. But he refused to commit to taking, half of the Gazans' population. Egypt has also said that they weren't going to take it. Gazans. So what the next steps in the Middle East are is yet unclear. So what I want to sort of spent the time on here is the Ukraine situation. So you probably have heard on the news that there was a regular one of the regular conferences, annual conferences in Munich, security conferences, and at that particular conference, um, it became clear, both in what was said during the conference and what was said outside the conference, that various officials, including our Secretary of Defense, uh, were making comments about the future of the Ukraine. Mr. Health, I can never pronounce his name, our Secretary of Defense, essentially misspoke, they now say. What's ironic about him misspeaking is that the Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee not only called it a boo-boo and an era of an unexperienced person, but he went so far as to say that what the Secretary of Defense was saying was inappropriate and nonsense. Then the next representative from the US was the Vice President Vance, and he too made comments that were alarming to anybody considering the future of the Ukraine. And if I can deviate for a minute, what Vance's speech did do was essentially to support the right-wing, somewhat neo-Nazi party in Germany. And you can imagine the Germans were outraged about that. And many people around the world were alarmed that a party which echoes, not entirely, but echoes Nazi themes and racism and all the rest of it, got support from the US Vice President. And needless to say, the Germans spoke up, as did others. And also, Germany is having an election, I think, in a couple of weeks. And of course, it's very inappropriate to weigh into an election of an ally, or for that, and under the best of circumstances. And so the US came out of the Vienna conference looking confused and confusing and alarming to Europeans in general. Now, one might ask, why are Europeans alarmed? I mean, there are a whole bunch of countries, they're quite strong. And they're alarmed about a number of things. They're alarmed about, number one, that they haven't been included in the conversation about the disposition of the Ukraine. Trump has had negotiations and long telephone conversations with Putin. And essentially, up until this point, the idea is that Putin and Trump would sort things out of the future of Ukraine, and that neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans need to be consulted at this particular point. I mean, at some future time, they might be told what the outcome of that negotiation is. Now, before I again focus more closely on the Ukraine, I want to remind us all that some time ago, before he became president, Trump was engaged in a discussion, I think, with the press about any resolution to the war in the Ukraine, and concern that the Europeans had that if the outcome of any peace negotiations and treaties in Ukraine were not kind of hard and fast and protected the Ukraine sovereignty, the other country that Putin might very well eventually try to move back into the Balkans and reclaim the territories that they lost during the Cold War. Trump's comment at the time, he wasn't president yet, it should be said. Trump's comment at the time was That's okay if they want to. The Russians want to go ahead and reclaim the countries in Europe that they lost at the end of the Cold War. It was okay with him, and of course the Europeans remember this, right? So the Europeans, quite aside from the concerns of the Ukrainians in Ukraine, in Zelensky in Ukraine, the Europeans are very mindful that any kind of ceasefire, if that's what it is, or any kind of arrangements between Putin and Trump that does not include them might potentially endanger them, right? Well, you say, well, they're all members of NATO, and the United States is a member of NATO. You may also recall that in the past, Trump has said that he's not particularly interested in NATO and that NATO countries need to cough up more money. Um, Europe understands this, and they're upping their contributions to NATO as we speak. They have a new head of NATO, the former Prime Minister of Holland, Rutte, who is quite good and quite coherent. And the Europeans understand, irrespective of the resolution with the Ukraine, that if NATO is going to have a future, they are going to have to contribute more percentage of their budgets to NATO. Um, it's also the case that Trump has floated this, you need to contribute more, at the same time that he says, well, maybe we're less interested in NATO. Maybe we can, get out of it or step back from it and so forth. So that then raised the question in Macron, President Macron of France, some time ago, half a year ago, of saying maybe Europe needs to think of developing its own force capacity outside of NATO, if NATO can, in a sense, be undermined by the United States. And one of the things being discussed as I record this in Paris is precisely that. That is, say, the initial reaction of many European countries were that they weren't particularly interested in having to pay for forces in addition to NATO. But now they've come around to the fact and saying that NATO might really be undermined in such a way that an independent European force needs to be raised to protect Europe, not just to help Ukraine, but to protect Europe from Putin moving beyond Ukraine into, God knows, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, whatever pleases him, which, as I said before, Trump is on the record saying he would be okay with that. So we are in the middle. Well, and then I should say that the comments that were made by our Secretary of Defense and Vice President didn't help the matter and alarmed the Europeans even more. I can't tell you at this point what the outcome of the conference in Paris today is, but you can see that we're dealing with a rather fast-moving situation. Now, back to the Ukraine. There is a meeting about the Ukraine in Saudi Arabia right now, and it is a discussion with the United States and the Saudis, and who have not been invited, neither the Europeans nor Zelensky of the Ukraine. As you can imagine, there is some consternation that the U.S. is trying to, deal with not only the Middle East situation, which is one ball of wax, but also with the Ukrainian situation without the participation of the Europeans and Zelensky. Zelensky has said in the conference in Vienna, he believes that if there's discussion about the future in Ukraine, the Ukrainians should be at the table. And ditto, the Europeans have also said the same thing. And Trump is essentially ignoring it. So from the American perspective, we are moving ahead with negotiations with Putin. And then, unhelpful comments are made by our Secretary of Defense and others from the administration about the fact that, of course, Ukraine is not going to get its land back. And of course, Ukraine will have to get adjusted to whatever agreement the Americans and the Russians conclude. Some voices, even some Republican voices, have said, well, actually, an ultimate solution to the Ukrainian situation may not be the first thing that happens. What would happen would be a ceasefire. But a ceasefire might be quite unsatisfactory and quite not manageable unless you then have NATO forces or European forces monitoring the ceasefire, because otherwise Russia will just, ignore it and move in, and also it will solidify the idea that the 20% of the Ukraine that Russia currently controls will in fact stay in Russian hands. So there are a lot of loose ends here. And what is scary to almost everybody in Europe, all leaders in Europe, and all, certainly the Ukrainians, is the idea that here you have a country that has been invaded, Ukraine, by the Russians, and somehow the Americans and the Russians are going to sort this one out. Now, it's even worse than that for the Ukrainians, because there's also an announcement on the Trump administration that one of the things that Ukraine has to do is hand over half of the rare earth minerals that are under Ukrainian soil. Now, you will know from other things that rare earth minerals are needed for modern technologies, computers, whatever, AI, whatever. And so it's really important for the US to have access to rare earth and not dependent on getting some rare earth from China and elsewhere. So Trump has essentially said, we've lost a lot of taxpayers' money arming you folks. And so you owe us, never mind the outcome of the negotiation, you owe us half of your rare earth minerals. In other words, saying to the Ukrainians, we don't really consider you a very sovereign country either. To just hand over your potential wealth, which you might need to rebuild your country by selling these minerals. We're just demanding them because, we've spent a lot of money on arms and so forth to your supply. I hope you're beginning to get the picture. The picture is two dictators, and I'm calling Trump a dictator, essentially saying, well, we can figure this Ukraine business out. And the American president having made very reassuring comments to Europe some months back by saying, yeah, well, if the Russians want to move back into the Balkan countries, I'm okay with that. It is scary as hell to the Europeans for justifiable reasons. Where is this all going to go? Pretty hard to know. The Europeans will have to stand up. The Zelensky and the Ukrainians will have to step up. But what does it mean to step up? I mean, are the Europeans going to send military to the Ukraine outside, and will they then maybe have to agree that Ukraine can join NATO, which had been a no-no up until now? Very difficult for me to unspool this and to figure out where we will be in a few weeks. What is clear that you have two dictators trying to make arrangements over a country that one of the dictators has invaded and taken 20% of its land. And of course, the Russians believe firmly that the Ukraine is theirs, even though actually Ukraine as an entity predates the existence of modern Russia. But, they left it. And one of the sort of side pieces for the future of Ukraine is when Ukraine, in a sense, in the last decades, got its independence from Russia, they agreed to hand over its nuclear arms. They not only have a nuclear energy facility, but it had nuclear arms. They would hand it over to Russia, right? That was part of the deal. And now they're probably rethinking about how, whatever happened to all of this. It's a nightmare for Zelensky. It's a nightmare for the Ukrainians. It's a future nightmare for Europe. And one thing has changed for sure, which I mentioned up front, namely the role of the U.S. in the world has fundamentally changed in the last few weeks, and everybody is, aware of it. Everybody is scared, and we are about, moving into new world order. Sure, there's still a UN. Sure, there's still NATO. Sure, there's still all these institutions, but the understandings of alliances and the relationship of Europe and the United States has fundamentally changed in the last few weeks. Where exactly it's going is at this point still hard to say. And even without Ukraine and the mess about Ukraine, you will recall that we have told Denmark that we're taking over Greenland. We have said that we would put tariffs on goods coming from European countries, and so on. Now, this all speaks of the unraveling of the post-World War II understanding of the long-standing alliance and support that Europe and the United States were engaged in. It's an odd thing to have happened and have unspooled so quickly in the administration of a new U.S. president. And of course, one of the hopeful things that one might be able to say is, well, maybe in 4 years somebody else will get elected. And what I want to point out is that even if a reasonable Republican or Democrat gets elected in the next U.S. election, this genie can't be put back in the bottle entirely. That is to say, the structure of the post-World War order, I will argue, has been frayed, perhaps destroyed. And so we are even a different U.S. policy coming into being after the next election really can't put this genie back in the bottle again. Yes, they can, renew certain alliances. Yes, they can make, all kinds of different arrangements, but basically it will be a new structure. Not necessarily the negative structure we have right now or that we're moving into in the next few years, but it will be a fundamentally different international structure. Now, you can say from an American point of view, we're still the strongest economy and this and that, and what do we care? And 50% of our fellow citizens essentially are disinterested and also ill-informed about US foreign affairs. We should concentrate on the United States. We should, look after ourselves, and not have our tax money go to other countries and so forth. There's a lot of that flavor. And the interesting thing about it is, where do fellow Americans get those ideas from? They don't just get them from, speeches from Trump in press conferences. They get these ideas from the fact that almost all Americans, certainly most blue-collar Americans, don't even listen to national news anymore. It's all online. It's all podcasts and online stuff, X and whatever, and where they get fed all kinds of inaccuracies, garbage, propaganda, and whatnot. So we've always had an ill-informed American populace in terms of foreign affairs. But now we're not just ill-informed as a country, or many of our citizens ill-informed, but inaccurately informed about what is going on in the world. So we are at an inflection point. Maybe we've already skipped over the inflection point, and I don't mean to keep, reiterating it, but it is a seriously dire situation. And if I go back to my sort of opening comments, one of the sad things is that we now have our Defense Department, State Department, all kinds of departments of government in disarray or headed by ill uh, informed, inappropriate people, whether it's in the security field, whether it's in defense and so forth, and that is very alarming because it means that the president, whatever crazy idea that Trump has on any given day, will be supported or actualized. And if anything, some of these incompetent people, like the Secretary of Defense, um, will be able to do incredible harm. The Secretary of State, one would think Rubio would be a more sensible person, but he has, as far as one can tell up to now, not a lot of back spine, uh, given his echoing of the fact that we are going to take back the Panama Canal, and not really speaking up in his news conference in Israel against some of the uh, ideas of Trump with respect to Gaza and so forth. So one can't really count on him. And the other thing is that many of the agencies of government now are losing the most experienced civil servants who, whether it's in USAID, which has been disintegrated, so to speak. I will talk about that some other occasion. But it's also other departments where totally incompetent people uh, either are having to take over, or low-level people which are inexperienced, or they will, based on Musk's, going after all the departments, will have people put into these places that are also not just have different views than the previous administration, but are ill-informed and often don't know what in the world they're talking about. And in the midst of all of this, you have very sort of strange pronouncements being made, which are not unrelated to the things I've discussed. For example, when the Secretary of State arrived in Israel, he also managed to comment that a very new supply of those 200,000 or whatever, those huge bombs that bombed the Schmiederines out of Gaza, were being supplied to Israel. Now, I'm actually not thinking those major huge bombs will be visited upon Gaza again. There's not that much more to destroy. I think that that is a bargaining chip with negotiations with Iran, saying, look, Israel has these huge bombs. If if we don't reach we, the US, don't reach some agreement with Iran, we can lob those bombs onto Tehran and make that place in smithereens. So that is not, an irrelevant kind of comment to be making. Supporting an extreme right-wing party is Germany also has its long-term consequences, not just in Germany, but all over the Middle East. So all kinds of the destruction of USAID is noteworthy in much of the world and is leading to famines and spread of disease and so forth. So we get out of World Health Organization. World Trade Organization is for all practical moribund. We will get out of many other UN agencies, probably again UNESCO and so forth. So it's not just these bad policies with respect to Ukraine and potentially the Middle East, and to go it alone, like we don't need allies, we don't want anybody else on the negotiation table, except once we pick. It is also a world that other people around the world are looking at and seeing that there is really serious unravelings of the mechanisms that were built after the Second World War to operate interdependently and internationally. We no longer believe in interdependence. We're going to act nationally, and these institutions are ones that we don't value, we will get out of, we will try to undermine, but we won't pay any attention to them. Or in the case of UNRWA, right, which has kept the Gazans alive, the charity organization, we just say, get away, get out of here. We don't want anything we won't allow you to be in Gaza anymore. We're certainly not financially going to support you, and so forth. So you see a kind of not not only major but even minor erosion of all the mechanisms that used to be allowed. Flawed, of course, everything can use reforms, but we're not talking about reforms now. We're talking about slash and burn. And there's been slash and burn about the entire post World II structure, and it's happening now, and it's, uh, the world is just looking onto it. Before I end, let me just say one word about China. China, looking at what's happening in Europe, might very well say to itself that whatever other relationship it has with the US, it's probably relatively safe for them to take over Taiwan in the next few years because the US is not going to really do anything about it. And that is also a major break or breach, if you will, with the understanding up until now that we were going to defend Taiwan no matter what. So if one imagines that everything I've talked about only pertains to Europe and the Middle East, it also has its implications for the thinking, especially of China, but the thinking in general of the Middle East. I'm sorry to have all this sort of bad news. We will continue, but the one thing none of us should do is to stick our heads into the sand and saying, it's so awful, I don't really want to participate in any of this. We need to play our role as citizens. We need to support people that maybe like thinking. We can't opt out because opting out will make things worse and worse. The Germans learned that, the Russians learned that. We can't just hide and say, well, we're going to watch, our streaming movies on the TV, and I can't, we don't want to hear anything about it. Please stay informed. Please, continue to have opinions. Please write and call your representatives if you have, want to support them. And I guess my bottom line is, we are all obliged to stay active and engaged. Thank you very much. I'll see you in 2 weeks.